What's the deal between swamps, bogs, and marshes? That's what we're going to talk about today. But I have to tell you, they're now one of my favorite places to go to observe nature. There is so much out there. And now it's just one of my favorite things. And then I noticed that I didn't really know the difference between a swamp, a bog, a marsh, and then there's a fourth one called a fen. So the reason is like I said, I go out and go into nature all the time. And sometimes I go to this really nice oak savanna, which has a lot of birds. And other times I go to forests. Forests are actually my favorite. But I have to tell you, marshes, bogs, swamps have a ton of animals, birds, critters that you just don't get to see everywhere else. And they're just kind of cool. They're so interesting. And so maybe you think about, well, like I did, Minecraft. Minecraft has swamps and bogs and all those types of things, and they're mucky. And, people just don't think a lot of them. But you know what? It is really interesting. And once you know the difference between them, you'll be able to spot the differences like that. So that's becoming a full-time nature detective. Now, in the Northwoods, like I said, we grew up, there were a lot of forests, but there weren't a lot of marshes. So the first one we're going to talk about is marshes. And marshes are wetlands that have grasses, reeds, open water, that kind of thing. There's a lot of open water in there. And you'll see them. They have the cattails in them. They're usually full light. They're kind of sunny. And a lot of times what you'll see are no trees, or maybe a few trees, but mostly grasses. And you find them around lakes, rivers, low-lying areas, wherever water gathers. Now, usually they are fresh water, but in the coastal areas, they can either be salty or completely salty, particularly along the Atlantic Ocean. There are some good saltwater marshes that are there. You've probably seen too, like cattails. Cattails are super cool that, they're kind of a brown stalk in their growing season. And then in the fall, they turn into white poofs and blow everywhere. Do you know my car is full of white poofs because of last year's cattail seeding? They were kind of fun. But the other part of it is you get to see all sorts of kinds of birds that you just don't see anywhere else. First of all, you get to see marsh wrens, sedge wrens, there's swamp sparrows. And sometimes you may see something like that in a forest, but they're more likely to be in marshes. And they love that area. And a lot of times you can see things like muskrats, beavers, those kinds of things. You can hear red-winged blackbirds calling, usually when you're in a marsh. There are leopard frogs and spring peepers that like to hang out there. It's a great place for herons, bitterns, and you'll even get a chance sometime to see a lot of ducks and a lot of things like pelicans, kingfishers, that kind of thing. So lately I've been going to this one particular marsh that nobody else knows about. I found a land that is owned by the county, and not many people go there and get to hang out for hours and hours and hours in this marsh without basically anyone else contacting you or seeing you. And so it's a lot of fun. One cool thing that we did when we were there the last couple of weeks is that we saw something, and I'll put a picture of him up there, and he was a nighthawk. I have never seen a nighthawk before, but all of a sudden I looked at this branch and I thought, that branch looks lumpy. What is up with that branch? And we got closer to it, and it was a nighthawk. And like I said, never saw one of those before. And then went to a different marsh another time. We have a federal marsh that's here, and a American bittern, which I had never seen before, flew right in front of the car. And then we were like, wow, what was that? Holy cow. And then about 3 minutes after that, least bittern flew right across the road as well. So the ability to see things that, like I said, you'll never see anywhere else. And if you get into bugs, boy, there's all kinds of bugs that only exist out in those marshland areas. So I highly recommend going and finding yourself a marsh. Marshes are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, for producing food and turning out oxygen and doing all the good things. They are on par with rainforests, and we don't think about them very often. I will, like I said, someday do a thing about this federal marsh. It was kind of interesting. A few years ago, they drained the marsh. And they wanted to get invasive fish that people put into the marsh. We'll see like great blue herons with goldfish in their mouth. And goldfish are not supposed to be in this area. They are not a fish we have here. So they drained the marsh, they cleaned out the invasive species, and then they refilled it up. And I found out there's this whole series of 9, I don't know, gates that they can open and close and change the water level of the marshes in my area. So that is really cool. And now it changes every year. I have to say that this marsh, this federal marsh we go to every year, is very cool because sometimes it's very wet and it's almost very lakey. And you'll see a lot of fish, you'll see a lot of turtles, beavers, those kinds of things. And other years it's a little bit drier and you get mud flats. And then suddenly you're seeing all the stilts and every kind of shorebird that you could imagine on the planet. So you go there every year, just a different place. And it's kind of cool to just see year after year what kind of year you're going to get. One of the cool things about marshes, too, is they filter the water. So it is a great way, not that you want them, like you put something in to filter the water, but they do a great job of filtering water and returning it to a pure form. So the fish and all the things that live in the marsh are getting a healthier ecosystem out of it. And what's cool about this federal marsh, too, I forgot about this as well, is that it got like taken over by vegetation back in the 1970s. I don't remember any of that, but it used to be this huge, expansive marsh that had a ton of geese and ducks and water birds, and was this ecological wonder. And then basically, there wasn't really much land management to it. There was runoff from farms, which produces a lot of fertilizer and makes everything in the marsh grow, and everything kind of got filled in. And so then there was no place for the ducks and the geese. They started going onto farmland and eating crops. And so suddenly this war kind of came up between the ducks and the geese and all the birds and the farmers. So what they did in this particular area, like I said, they cut all the vegetation out and they restored the marsh. So marsh restoration is a big part of what people are doing these days. I think we thought of marshes and wetlands as being non-productive land. And if we could turn them into farmland, isn't that better? We could grow food in it. But now we're finding out it's an important, valuable resource that we have as a land type in any state and any area. And birds, like I said, they're migratory birds, look for those wetlands. There are animals that look for those wetlands. And one of the big things that I talked about before in the podcast about beavers is that England and Europe got rid of a lot of beavers. I mean, they were gone, I think, from England and Scotland. And what they didn't realize is those beavers go into these wetlands and dam up little areas. And so instead of having this giant lake, there's just little pools of water all over the place. That is harder to dry up during droughts. And so it actually protects itself, the beavers, by making these dammed up ponds. I think people felt like the beavers were interrupting the natural flow of water. And instead, it found out that the beavers themselves were protecting the natural flow of water. So then the next one we have is swamps. What's a swamp other than being what you walk around in Minecraft? It is a forested wetland. And so it has trees growing in standing water. And you might be wading around and there's bald cypress trees, knobby knees that poke above the water surface. You can sometimes see that. Helps the trees oxygenate. There's all kinds of trees that grow in there. Now, there's two main kinds. There's the forested swamps, like I said, the cypress swamps. There's also shrub swamps. And these are the ones that are in my neck of the woods or where I go birding. That for the most part, they may have a tree here and there, but they have woody bushes in the trees. And in that particular area, we get a lot of warblers, flycatchers. There are a lot of bugs in that area. And any kind of bird that likes bugs, they'll get into that particular area. And there's even saltwater versions. Those are called mangrove swamps. I think I've seen a bunch of those when I traveled to Florida. They're in tropical coastlines, and they act like a living storm barrier. So they protect the coastlines from hurricanes and soil erosion. When there was a thing on Disney that talked about different kinds of animal, I watch all sorts of animal documentaries. And the fish that need sheltered protection to put their eggs in so they don't get battered around by the coast will go into these mangrove swamps and put their eggs in there, and they're protected. So, like I said, the eggs can grow and then eventually become little fishies too. So there you have it. And some things that you might find when you're looking at a swamp compared to the marshes, the other marshes, is that you can see turtles. They love to sun themselves on logs. All sorts of turtles we've seen. This is where we got a chance to see a sora walking around on top of a wood as they were crossing the marsh. Owls like to be in the trees just above the swamp. Lots of things to eat in there. And if you're in a warmer area, not like me in the Northwoods, alligators. You might see alligators peeking in this. One of the fun things about swamps is that they often smell earthy. They don't smell rotten. It's tannins that are coming out of the tree and the bark, and it can turn the color of the water brown, almost like a tea. That's one of those things that we saw when we went into that little private swamp that we went into last week, that it had this brown hue to it, and we went, yuck, gross. Then I found out all it is the tannins leaching out of the tree material. So what you're smelling is not rottenness. You should not smell rottenness unless something died, which I have seen that too. But you mostly smell earthiness, which is kind of cool. Then we have bogs, and bogs are kind of different. I don't know that I've seen many bogs in my life, but they're spongy. They have a weird name, bog, and they are oftentimes in northern climates, cool temperatures with a lot of rain. And what they do is they sort of form a sponge-like wetland. It's not unlike a marsh or a swamp. It's rain-fed. It's not connected to flowing river, but it is just coming in from the rain. And because there's no water flow there, they are considered to be nutrient poor. They're considered to be acidic, and they're kind of a tough place for most plants to live. You'll see sphagnum moss living there, and that is really cool. That is a cool kind of moss. In fact, if you probably see back there, I'm going to build a terrarium out of that little glass thing. And part of my recipe for building that is I need some sphagnum moss, so I'm going to find out where I can find that. But essentially, it's a very spongy moss that's about 20 times its weight in water. It's a very dense thing. It was used in World War II as a wounds dressing because it's absorbent, it's mildly antiseptic, and it actually made a pretty good thing for field medicine. So that's cool. It's, like I said, nutrient poor. The plants get creative. That's where you see like some of those plants, like the pitcher plant, the Venus flytraps, that will trap insects in their leaves and digest them. The competition is different there. Or there's something called sundew, where it kind of gets kind of sticky hairs on its leaves when dew comes in, and it traps bugs almost like flypaper. So bogs do things to preserve itself, to live and create, and they find unusual ways to survive in that. And it's the thing that was in Lord of the Rings where they said they had the dead bodies. Fens are a little bit fancy. Now, fens I've never heard of, but it's a cousin of the bog. They are groundwater fed, which means that they have spring water. So that makes them rich in nutrients. Unlike the bog, they're filled with grasses, wildflowers, sedges, low shrubs. Gosh, I actually wonder if that place near my house might be a fen. Might be a fen. I'm going to have to figure this out. But fens tend to be alkaline or neutral instead of acidic. And they have a whole bunch of different kinds of life in there. If a bog is mysterious and creepy, fens are colorful. It's almost like a fantasy, you would see fairies flying or something like that. But they're pretty and lighter, and they're much more diverse in the kinds of plants that grow there. And they can become bogs over time if moss starts to creep in and take over the whole area. But for the most part, because they get the fresh water, they actually do a little bit better with rare species. And sometimes in fens, you'll see orchids, gentians, rare species of sedge. I have sedge growing in my yard. I love growing sedge. And they also will tend to have a lot of butterflies. Doesn't fen sound magical? And it's really kind of cool. Fens are actually, it says, very rare. So maybe my thing is not a fen, but they're easily damaged They're very sensitive to humans trampling on them or garbage getting thrown into them. And so a lot of places you'll see them, they're kind of roped off because restoration programs are trying to bring them back to life, and we can do a lot of damage to them. So there you have it. There are marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens. They're all a little bit different. They all soak up floodwater. They all filter pollution. They all trap carbon, and they all provide habitats for birds, amphibians, fish, insects, all sorts of things. But like I said, a little bit different. We've been doing a lot of restoration types of things in my neck of the woods, taking out invasive species, that drastic case of draining them, replanting whatever it is that you're expected to have there, and protecting people from walking in those areas. So my challenge to you is the next time you see one of these sort of watery areas, try to identify it. Is it a bog, a swamp, a marsh, or a fen? Wouldn't that be cool? All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you watching. Please remember that you can always email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I would love to hear about your outside adventures. And if there's something that you always were curious about, a topic that made you just wonder what the heck is going on, let me know. I'd love to talk about it. Actually, this podcast started, and I haven't done that podcast yet, when my friend Em and I were walking in wintertime at a marsh of all things, and the marsh was iced over, and it was making this groaning noise. And we were like, what's that? And I said, it would be cool if there was a podcast that talked about these weird things that we could learn more about. Thanks so much. I appreciate you watching. And until next time, keep your muddy boots around and get out there and go see a swamp or something.